90 days ago, I started logging every financial decision I made. I thought I was going to find out I was overspending on food, maybe subscriptions, something obvious that I already half suspected. What I actually found was a pattern so consistent it was almost embarrassing. Over 3 months, I made the same type of mistake 94 times. Not the same dollar amount, not the same category. The same underlying decision structure repeated across spending, saving, and investing in slightly different clothing each time. The average cost per instance was $31. 94 of them over 90 days adds up to $2,914. That is in a single quarter. Annualized, that is one behavioral pattern costing me roughly $11,600 a year. Not market volatility. Not inflation. Not my income level. One repeating pattern I had been running on autopilot since my early 20s. Here is what I want you to sit with before we get into the data. I track numbers for a living. I read the behavioral finance research. I know what the biases are and how they work. And I still found this in my own decisions. It tells you something important about how invisible these patterns are until you actually measure them. My name is Victor, and on this channel we run real financial experiments so you do not have to guess. I started this experiment because most personal finance content tells you what you should do without ever showing you what happens when a real person actually tries. So I built a logging system. Every financial decision I made for 90 days got recorded. The amount, the category, the emotional context at the moment I made it, and whether I considered it deliberate or automatic. 4 categories: spending, saving, investing, and avoidance. That last one matters more than most people ever quantify. Financial avoidance, the decision not to look at something or not to deal with something, has a real cost. Most tracking systems ignore it entirely. By day 90, I had 847 logged decisions. When I ran the pattern analysis, one finding stood out so clearly it changed how I think about personal finance. The damage was not coming from the big decisions. Not the car, not the vacation, not the major purchase that feels significant in the moment. The damage was concentrated in a category of small decisions I had never once stopped to examine. Before I started the log, I had a hypothesis. Most behavioral finance researchers would point to loss aversion as the primary threat to financial health. That is the concept Kahneman and Tversky established in their 1979 prospect theory paper. A loss of $100 feels roughly twice as painful as a gain of $100 feels good. That asymmetry distorts how people invest, how they carry debt, and how they react to financial setbacks. I expected loss aversion to show up everywhere. I also expected present bias. That is the tendency to overvalue what you can have right now against what you could have later. It explains why savings goals fail and why people spend instead of building reserves. What I did not expect was what the data actually showed. Financial psychologists Brad Klontz and Ted Klontz identified 4 money script categories that shape most people's financial behavior: money avoidance, money worship, money status, and money vigilance. I assumed I was firmly in the vigilance category. I track numbers. I follow this research. I believed I was the person who had already done the examination. I was not. Not in practice. The money vigilance type, in Klontz's framework, often develops early, usually from watching financial instability as a child or from a period of genuine scarcity that left a mark on how you relate to money. The vigilance response is adaptive in a crisis. In stable conditions, it can calcify into a kind of hyper-awareness that functions more like anxiety than actual oversight. You feel like you are paying attention. The log showed me I was not. The first 2 weeks looked normal. Spending decisions were mostly deliberate. A few grocery runs, utility bills, and one book I had been meaning to buy for 2 years. Saving decisions were consistent. Investing was quiet. Avoidance decisions were low. I genuinely thought this was going to be a boring experiment. Then week 3 happened. I noticed a pattern in the emotional context column. On days when I was behind on work, tired, or dealing with anything stressful, the nature of my decisions changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would show up on a bank statement. But in the log I could see it. On a normal day, a spending decision took me about 4 seconds. I would check the amount mentally against my available cash, decide, and move on. On a high-stress day, that window dropped to under a second. The decisions were not bigger or more indulgent. They were just less considered. Faster choices that prioritized immediate relief over what I actually wanted. Psychologists call this ego depletion. When your cognitive resources are under strain, you default to the path of least resistance. For most people, that path costs money. By the end of week 4, I had 212 log decisions. 41 of them fell into what I started calling the automatic category. Not impulsive in the traditional sense, just unexamined. Made quickly without reference to anything I actually valued financially. Roughly 22 were small convenience purchases. 11 were subscription renewals or service fees I did not consciously review. 8 were financial tasks I chose to handle quickly instead of thoughtfully. None of them felt like mistakes in the moment. That was exactly the point. They felt like normal days. The month 2 data got more interesting. At the 60-day mark, I found something I had not expected from week 4. The automatic decisions were not random. They clustered, most frequently on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings. After I had been on my phone for more than 90 minutes, within 2 hours of any emotionally charged conversation, whether that conversation had anything to do with money or not. That last part surprised me more than anything else in the data. The emotional context of a financial decision does not have to be financial. Stress from a work situation, a difficult conversation, a frustrating hour, all of it shows up in how you handle money that same day. None of it shows up in your bank statement as an explanation. 94 automatic decisions across 90 days, concentrated in predictable windows. I started noticing that awareness of the pattern did not immediately change the pattern. Knowing that Tuesday evenings were a depletion window did not stop me from making 3 automatic decisions the following Tuesday. Knowledge without a structural response turned out not to be enough. That was one of the more useful findings in the data. Here is where it got genuinely strange. I pulled the avoidance column separately. These were the decisions not to look. The times I did not open my investment account after a news event. The week I delayed reviewing my monthly expenses by 6 days because I had a bad feeling about what I would find. I paid the bill without reading the statement. The credit card I had set to auto-pay years ago and had not reviewed since. 67 avoidance decisions in 90 days. More than one every other day. I ran the financial cost of each one I could trace. One forgotten subscription, $19.99 a month for 14 months. A balance transfer offer I had meant to review for 6 weeks. The interest during those 6 weeks cost me $43. A savings account I had not checked. The rate had dropped from 4.8% to 3.1% 8 weeks earlier, and I had not moved the funds. Small numbers individually. Together, they added up to $847 in traceable avoidance costs across 90 days. That number does not include the compounding that had already started. And here is the finding I think most personal finance content misses entirely. Avoidance decisions cost more than spending decisions in most cases because they compound silently. Every week you do not review your subscriptions, a few dollars leave automatically. Every month you delay a refinancing conversation, you pay the higher rate. Every quarter you skip a portfolio review, your allocation drifts further from where you intended it. None of these shows up as a purchase. None of them feels like a decision at the time. But they are decisions, and over 90 days the financial cost of my 67 avoidance decisions was larger than the cost of my 94 automatic spending decisions combined. Think about your own last 90 days. Not what you spent money on, the things you chose not to look at. What is that number? When I ran the full analysis at day 90, the behavioral pattern running through almost everything was not loss aversion. It was not present bias. It was money vigilance that had never been applied to actual monitoring. I had the mindset without the habit. I cared about my finances intensely in the abstract, but was not looking at them with any regularity. And because I believed I was a vigilant person, I never once questioned whether I was vigilant in practice. Klontz's research suggests this is common among people who identify strongly with financial awareness. The money vigilance type tends to be the person most anxious about finances and least likely to have clear current visibility into them. The anxiety and the avoidance reinforce each other. They have been reinforcing each other for years, in most cases, quietly, without anyone noticing. Shlomo Benartzi at UCLA has documented what he calls the ostrich effect, the measurable tendency of investors to check their portfolios less often during periods of market decline. What my data showed was a version of that running across everyday decisions, not just in investing, but across spending, saving, and avoidance simultaneously. On the days I felt most uncertain financially, I looked least often. That is the opposite of what helps. What I found in 90 days of my own data was not a character flaw or a discipline problem. It was a structural gap. I had been measuring outputs, account balances, and spending totals without measuring the inputs that produce them, the actual decisions, the conditions under which they happen, and the decisions I was consistently choosing not to make at all. Here is the three-step process I built directly from that data. First, a 10-minute weekly financial review. Not a deep audit. 10 minutes every Sunday. Account balances, any automatic transactions that have been posted, and one question, is there anything I am not currently looking at that I should be? This single habit addressed about 60% of the avoidance decisions in my log. Second, identify your depletion windows. Look at the last month of your spending and find where the automatic decisions cluster. Once you know the window, apply one rule. Any non-essential spending decision made during that window gets delayed 24 hours. Not canceled, just delayed. Research on implementation intentions shows that a 24-hour delay reduces automatic spending decisions by around 40%. Third, each month count your avoidance decisions, not your spending, your avoidance. That number is the real signal. Most people trying to improve their finances focus entirely on the spending column. This experiment convinced me that the avoidance column is where the compounding damage actually lives. Once you can see it, you can start making it smaller. You do not need perfect behavior. You need better data about yourself. Next week, I am running the math that most people in their 30s need to see and rarely do. I took 3 different investment starting ages, the same monthly contribution, and ran the full 30-year projection using current market data and real inflation figures. The gap between starting at 30 and starting at 40 is not what any calculator I have found online will actually show you. This is Victor Wealth Experiment. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next experiment.